I want to talk about types of formal and informal social control. So again, you might ask yourself then, if you have all sorts of societies historically that have bands and tribes and chiefdoms where there wasn't really coercive authority, especially in bands and tribes, was it just like zero social rules? People just do whatever they want, individual freedom, completely laissez-faire? No, no, really not. Instead, every society has some sense of social order. In every society, you can observe some degree of social power, people getting other people to do stuff. That can be persuasive or coercive or a blend of the two. Persuasive means I'm going to try to convince you to do this voluntarily. Coercive, I'm going to make you do this. And coercive, of course, could be like violently coercive, or it could be more like there will be a financial penalty. But if you think about it for a second, the financial penalty is often backed up by a force penalty. I might get a driving ticket with a fine attached to it. Let's say it's a traffic camera one like they have in some places, and maybe I don't even ever encounter a law enforcement officer, but I get a ticket in the mail and then I'm supposed to pay it. But if I don't pay it, well, I could just choose not to pay it, right? Well, not really, right? Then there might be things like warrants or something like that. Obligatory, I am not a lawyer. But anyways, the point is that coercive authority can come in many forms, sometimes overt force, sometimes financial penalty or employment penalty with the implicit threat of force. Social control then, though, is the ability to get people to use social power to get people to follow the norms of a society. It can be informal or formal. It can be super spelled out. We are now telling you what to do. Or informal, right? You're going at somebody at a restaurant. You're not like, excuse me, I'm your leader and you need to follow this social norm, but we get what's going on. And it can be internalized or externalized, although that tends to be kind of, those are often one and the same. It's kind of a spectrum. Internalized means like I'm controlling myself, right? Like I have a conscience. You should, you're human. And that conscience is partly informed by my society's rules. Or externalized, right? Somebody showing up to me and saying, do this, right? So as you can see, informal often goes with internalized, formal with externalized, though not always. Informal means of social control are many. Basically, any system in which to get respect, you need to follow certain norms. Any ideological system in which it's sort of like, well, it is right or wrong to do X, Y, or Z. In that, I think I had you read it, but in that Leah Schaefer piece, Is a More Generous Society Possible? She talks about among Ik people in Uganda, people tended to be more generous in a hypothetical game people were playing if they were told like the ancestors are like watching you and like remember our like cultural values of generosity, right? So ideology, by which I mean a belief system of some sort, a discursive system, right, is an informal means of social control. Since the 70s, there's been a lot of work in anthropology on what's called hegemony or hegemony theory by Gramsci and others. So this idea is sometimes like powerful entities that are sort of controlling discourse, controlling how, or like sort of promoting certain ways of thinking and talking to kind of get people to do what they want them to do, right? And sometimes establishing almost sort of bumpers, by which I mean like if you bowl in a bumper bowling alley, right? Over how people tend to think about an issue. Respect, negative sanctions, you receive some kind of negative social penalty from this, and then consensus-based forms, right? Social control in this sense is very persuasive, right? We all get together, we made a decision, and now we're going to persuade each other that we're going to do the decision that we all agreed upon together. Those would all be examples of informal means of social control. And as you can see in those examples, some informal means involve everybody gets a say, and some involve powerful people get a say, but they're informal, it's not formalized like a written law. Aboriginal Australian folks prior to colonialism are a very, very good example of a specific kind of informal social control of sacred lands, a topic I find fascinating and quite beautiful. In this context, in Aboriginal Australian context, with the dreaming, which is a very difficult concept to convey in English to people that are not used to it, and I'm probably going to do a poor job, but the idea in the dreaming or dream time of a spiritual reality parallel to our own that manifests in and affects our reality, perhaps sort of another time, another plane, but which through those stories attach certain people to certain places. As in like this clan, your clan is connected to this sacred story of your ancestor or your totemic ancestor from this specific area. So people kind of have a sense of where they're supposed to live based on sacred stories. And it obviously reduces sort of a need for, sort of like a formally defined border with a gate or something, or some kind of legal authority. If people are, for the most part, agreeing with a system of sacred stories that defines who lives where, and that's kind of what's going on there, not implying the system was perfect or that everybody bought in, but that's kind of a general idea. There was movement, but there was a sense that certain clans tended to care for or be involved in certain areas over others. Joking is another form of social control, arguably an informal social control. There's lots and lots of examples. We sometimes use memes or teasing to kind of make fun of social behaviors that we don't like or that we think are silly. There's a great book by Keith Basso called Portraits of the White Man. He talks about Western Apache people back in the 70s doing jokes where they pretended to be white people. Context, really important context. At that point, most people on that reservation, their main encounters with white folks in that historic period of time, unless they were going off of the reservation to a border town or something, most of the time people that were coming into the reservation that weren't themselves Western Apache were people like missionaries, religious missionaries, or doctors was really common, or salespeople, things like that. So as a result, you have all these jokes that kind of poke fun at those behaviors that would be characteristic of those professions. So for example, somebody pretends to be quote unquote a white man. Really, they're pretending to be a white doctor, where they like come up to somebody, they're like, hey, how you doing? How you doing? What's wrong with your nose? What's going on with your bedroom life? Blah, 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 and like ask all these like overly personal questions, which in Western Apache society would be like highly appropriate. And the person that's having the joke done to them kind of just ends it by like shaking their head, and they're like kind of embarrassed, and they're just kind of like, white men are crazy, right? Now, that seems like a funny joke. And, you know, if you're in that culture, it is a funny joke, perhaps. That's not really the point, though, that I want to use it for. Whether or not that's a funny joke for our purpose is entirely irrelevant, and it's probably not very funny if you're not from that community. Indeed, jokes are often not funny outside of the cultural context that they're in. The point, though, is for everybody else in the room that's hearing these jokes, it's a reminder of how outsiders behave, which is implicitly a reminder of how insiders ought to behave, how Apache people ought to behave, as Keith Bassett points out. So it's a very, very good example of we're using joking behavior with a pretty serious point, right? It is joking behavior. We're trying to have a good time with each other, or a funny time or something, or maybe a good time at the expense of someone else. But we're also doing social power, social control. We're sending messages about who we are as a society, whether we mean to or not. So jokes are a powerful form of social control. Formal means of social control are numerous, and you should be extremely well familiar with them living in 21st century. Formalized mechanisms would be things like written law, often with the threat of force or imprisonment if one were to violate them. That would be an obvious form of formal social control. In autocratic systems, of course, that can be decoupled from laws, and sort of social control by force can be exerted without a written law having been violated, obviously. And so that would still be a formal mean of social control. It doesn't have to involve sort of written law, but it's sort of like designated authority figures that can exert overt and clearly we're announcing what this is, social control over people, right? So it is very often coercive, but not always coercive. If you, I'm just like a hypothetical society, if you had a hypothetical society where like government gets to like put give you a star on your license for you were a good citizen because you recycled that day or something, that's like not a real example. It's a ludicrous example, not the least of which because you're causing litter by doing the stickers. But anyways, if you had something like that, that would be an example of a form of social control without coercion. It doesn't have to be coercive, but often is. Formal means of social control. Other examples, some of which aren't coercive or by force, would be like Capel Moots is a really good example. So among Capel people in Africa, historically, you would have sort of like an elder who becomes a decision maker when there's like a fight between two people, a conflict. But what's interestingly is you get like villages historically were divided into quadrants, and you get like the different quadrants together, or the different families that are debating that are related to the two individuals, get them together. And so the kind of people on both sides of like whoever's like accusing or being accused, or whoever's like saying I'm owed this, I'm owed this, people from both sides, they're then like forced to sit together. So it's none of this like we're on one side of the courtroom, you're on one side of the courtroom. It's like everybody's like forcibly, like not forced, but like expected to sit amongst each other. And then they air out what was happening. But interestingly, it's not just the decision maker, it's not just the accused or accuser, or whatever the case may be, whatever the dispute is. It's not just the disputants. It's also like anybody in the village can like stand up and be like, well, here's what I saw and here's what I think about it. So it's kind of like a witness, but it's kind of like anybody can voluntarily choose to be a witness and just stand up and start talking, and you're expected to listen to them. And eventually the decision maker makes a decision historically. But interestingly, oftentimes there was restitution going both ways, where both sides have to pay a penalty, which I find fascinating. Not as heavy of a penalty if you were in the right, as it were, but some kind of like gift giving. So maybe a penalty is the wrong word, but sort of obligatory gift giving that says this dispute is over and done. We have buried that particular hatchet. Inuit song duels historically in Canada were also a good example, what we now call Canada. Historically, Inuit people would sing about their grievances against each other. I've not seen a lot of like record of this like from Alaska among Inupiat communities, but in certain Inuit communities in Canada, this was widespread, and in Greenland, where people would sort of like sing about something that was bothering them that another person had done. And then like they'd get the whole village together, or two villages if you're from two different villages, and like, I'm going to sing what you did, and I'm going to sing my response. And it goes back and forth. And sometimes the way it was decided sort of who had sort of won the duel, as it were, or who was in the right or in the wrong, was like whoever got the most laughs. Now you might be saying that's an interesting way to decide how to settle the conflict. Just because you got the most laughs doesn't mean you're right. But, you know, it's sort of an implication, I think, that like you've told the best narrative, and we're now all buying into the fact that you were in the right and the other person was in the wrong, and we're showing it through our laughter. Contrary to popular belief, you do have some ability of your control, or your ability to laugh, by the way. So bear that in mind. So anyways, Inuit song duels, fascinating example of a very formal form of social control, but one without force, typically. So where is that the last slide? Is that the last slide? Oh, okay. No, it was just being weird. Okay. So I had a few example too of not song duels, but teasing cousin songs. There's a great reading I do in my other class by Deanna Kingston, an Inupiat anthropologist, about King Island teasing cousin songs. It's really, really good. And she talks about all these like songs that people sing where they usually like tease one of their cousins, specifically a cross cousin, if I'm remembering correctly, about sort of like something they did kind of embarrassing. So they talk about like a little girl who complained about the weather because she didn't wear the right footwear, or another time like a guy who gave a helicopter pilot bad instructions, and that caused a delay in a helicopter pilot life flighting somebody else out to a hospital. The person, from what I gather, was fine, so it wasn't like deadly serious, but it was kind of like embarrassing, and the person kind of like gave bad directions or whatever. And so those songs are done in front of people. So part of what they do is just have fun, right? It's fun and it's funny, and you're teasing somebody. I personally, as the youngest child, hate teasing, but whatever. It's some teasing. But they perform a social value as well, right? As Kingston kind of touches on, like it kind of like sends messages about sort of like, you know, dress for the weather, don't complain about the weather, especially if you didn't dress for it, be cautious in how you give directions, things like this. All right, well, that was, I hope, an interesting lecture. One of the biggest points I want to make here is no society exists without some form of social control. Every society has to make decisions about how we're going to be as a society and how we're going to live harmoniously. But fascinatingly, there are many societies that have done so without governments. And not only that, but many societies in which there are governments, a lot of the social control happens on this informal person-to-person level. I shush you, I glare at you, I honk at you, I joke about you. We do all these informal things to kind of try to get people to follow the norms. And, you know, we resist the norms and sometimes push back on norms. And sometimes a norm that was a norm becomes not the norm anymore. So that's a little bit about politics. Hopefully you found it interesting. Thank you very much for your time. Farewell. If my computer will let me, farewell. Farewell.